Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, we are joined by Samir, Shrestha, and Sharmin Hossain, two US-based organizers from the South Asian diaspora communities of Nepal and Bangladesh, respectively, to talk about the history and continued struggles of the international Gen Z uprisings, which have only really made a blip in Western media coverage. They'll discuss the history of those movements and the political conditions which created them, as well as help us understand how Americans can be in meaningful solidarity with people's movements abroad. But first, these headlines. As we all know, Trump backed down on his genocidal threats against Iran and its people with a flimsy and frankly confusing ceasefire agreement. Both parties disputed the agreed terms of ceasefire almost immediately, and Israel continued its violent assault against Lebanon. We're not shocked to learn then that diplomacy talks led by J.D. Vance and mediated by Pakistan failed in less than 2 days. As a result, Trump has once again employed his attention-baiting tactics and outsized threats, stating Sunday that the Strait of Hormuz will now be blockaded by U.S. naval fleets. Sure. Since the beginning of this illegal war, which the New York Times reported last week was expressly prompted by Benjamin Netanyahu presenting a pitch to Trump in mid-February, the details and decisions about what to do and where to go have moved really fast. That may be on purpose. The administration is applying their all-too-familiar flood-the-zone strategy to illegal wars now, and that even includes overwhelming MAGA partisans like Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who seems to have not received his pro-war talking points. Johnson stated in a seemingly nervous tone after Trump's civilization-ending threat,
I am hoping and praying that President Trump this really is bluster. I do not want to see us start blowing up civilian infrastructure.
Speaking of Wisconsin, last week, Chris Taylor was elected to the state Supreme Court. She's another liberal justice who will replace an outgoing conservative justice, cementing the liberal majority in a major battleground state. The state Supreme Court deals heavily with redistricting in Wisconsin, which is a prime reason that these races have been a huge focal point for organizers in the state. Taylor's electoral victory cements that liberal majority until at least 2030. Finally, Viktor Orban, who is now the former Prime Minister of Hungary, decisively lost this weekend's parliamentary elections, which is good news. Orban has been the model for right-wing autocratization in the West. After maintaining power for 16 years and whittling away at Hungarian democracy, he finally conceded after his party was absolutely crushed in this weekend's election. He was defeated by TISA, a Big Tent opposition party headed by 45-year-old Peter Magyar, who is a former insider in Orban's government. Magyar had distanced himself from Orban after a sex abuse scandal overseen by Orban's officials. Since then, Magyar has received support from Hungarian civil society, social movements, and a broader public that has long struggled to unite against Orban. Organizers in Hungary strategically brought together a diverse coalition over the last decade to overcome Orban's rule. They organized in rural communities that were often left out of opposition strategies, and united teachers with students and parents to protest funding cuts that fundamentally impacted more than just the workers. They also worked alongside Hungarian Roma communities, ensuring that the oppressed minority group would not be left out of a renewed government. Before this, Orban maintained an iron grip over the political system and consolidated the country's media to the point where 80% of the media market was under the control of his allies. Magyar represents an opportunity for Hungary to shift away from Trump and Putin and shows what it may take to topple would-be dictators who are amassing power within liberal democracies.
Hey everybody, this is Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. I read and give to Convergence because it has become a home for me to engage in critical analysis, find practical advice for organizing and strategy, and inspiration in the belief that a better world is not only possible, we can build it.
To make either a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, visit convergencemag.com/donate. You can find a direct link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
Over the past few years, a series of popular uprisings across the world have been described by mainstream media as the Gen Z uprisings, movements led by young people and described in Western media as generally being against government corruption. These movements have been most notably visible in our own media due to their use of technology, including platforms like Discord and TikTok, and internationally consistent adoption of pop culture symbolism, like the flag of the Straw Hat Pirates, a black flag with a grinning Jolly Roger wearing a straw hat. This flag is the banner of the protagonists of the long-running hit anime series One Piece, whose adventures often find them coming to the defense of marginalized communities around their world. But these movements didn't come out of nowhere, or out of just the internet for that matter. Understanding their origins and the elections that have resulted from their successes can shed light both onto the international struggle against authoritarianism and the challenges that we face building an alternative. In this episode, we're looking at two countries in particular, Nepal and Bangladesh, where popular uprisings in the summer of 2024 and fall of 2025 have led to elections this year. I was recently joined by two US-based organizers, Sharmin Hossain and Samir Shrestha, whose work as part of the South Asian diaspora has rooted them in movement work here in the US while maintaining relationships and solidarity abroad. Take a listen. Sharmin Hossain is a Bangladeshi Muslim organizer from Queens, New York, who's currently the organizing director for 18 Million Rising. Sharmin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I love Convergence.
Thank you. And Samir Shrestha belongs to the indigenous Newari tribe of Nepal, where he was born. He spent the past 18 years involved in movement work here in the US. And Samir, it's really good to see you this morning.
It's really good to see you too, Kaden.
Well, to start us off, let's try and set some context, because we are sort of taking on like a pretty big phenomenon, and we're trying to do some sort of like basically like comparative politics in a lot of ways here. Let's start with you, Sharmin. I'm wondering if you can give us kind of a quick gloss of the 2024 uprisings in Bangladesh, where Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and her party were ousted from power. What are the sort of themes of the protests, and then the way that the state responded, and where are we kind of now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to talk about my country and all the amazing things that happen, because I think the global South really forges like new possibilities as far as like what we can do and consolidate as far as power goes. So today is actually March 26th, and it's Bangladeshi Independence Day, coincidentally.
Happy Independence Day.
Happy Independence Day. I find it very serendipitous for us to delve into this layered and complex history of the student movement. So the Bangladesh student protests of July 2024 were deeply rooted in systemic inequalities that the young working class and the poor faced. Nearly 32 million young people were actually out of the workforce or education in a population of a country of 170 million. So that's a pretty significant number. And so that issue was a focal point for widespread discontent in the country. In July of 2024, the High Court of Bangladesh actually reinstated a quota system for government jobs after an appeal was made when the then ruling Hasina government abolished the quota system because in 2018, she faced a lot of pressure from student protesters. But this quota system is really interesting, and it represents a lot. It reserved 30% of government jobs for descendants of freedom fighters. And in Bangladeshi history, that's a very complex and layered identity. Millions of our ancestors actually fought in the Liberation War against the US-backed Pakistani military. And the Bangladeshi Liberation War and the genocide in Bangladesh actually resulted in the death of over 3 million people who sacrificed for the birth of our nation. And so for the Hasina government, the quota system was actually what she used to appoint a lot of her loyalists and her supporters to high levels of government, the military, and it basically created the political ecosystem for the Awami League, her party, to maintain dominance. And the Awami League actually was the party that once led the liberation struggle. And over the course of 15 years, we actually saw how much they consolidated power through political repression, the Digital Security Acts that was surveilling and targeting freedom of speech, as well as the corruption and fear that they stoked against their opposition. And these government jobs, like most of us, it represents many things. It represents the government's responsibility to take care of poor people, economic and political opportunity. And it also represents like the corruption and the authoritarian rule of the Awami League and how they were rigging elections and how the court systems and even entrance exams for the Bangladeshi civil service were actually regularly leaked and compromised. And so within that background, that's when you have the Students Against Discrimination movement take the streets in July, demanding fair access to government jobs. And things actually got violent really fast. Within 7 days, nearly 174 people were murdered and thousands were injured. There was an indefinite curfew, social media blackouts, and then a military occupation with shoot-on-sight orders. And of course, the bullets that were raining upon Bangladeshis were U.S. Arms. So students were terrorized by these vigilante groups that were collaborating with the Bangladeshi police. And these student groups were actually organized by the Bangladeshi Awami League. These student groups were notorious for repressing student elections, sexually assaulting students, really threatening people that were running for student elections. And so there's already this like vigilante ecosystem that exists within the campuses that was weaponized during the student protests. And then you have a climax moment on July 14th. Sheikh Hasina went on television accusing the students of being Razakars. And Razakars are collaborators of the Pakistani army. And it's a very derogatory term in Bangladesh, and it refers to people who support the Pakistani military's operation to suppress the Bangladeshi Liberation War. They're also accused of heinous crimes. And so when students were accused of being Razakars, it like lit a fire. Millions took the streets that day and they were like, oh, hell no. Like, how dare she disrespect us? Well, there's thousands of people who are on the streets, blood everywhere. Rickshawalas are having to pull students into hospitals. There's just so much violence happening on the ground. And so on that National Day of Action, July 15th, clashes happen. Multiple deaths are live streamed. And one of them, Abu Saeed, he was a university student at Rangpur University in Northwest Bangladesh, really galvanized the country because we watched this student who is not armed surrender and get shot by the Bangladeshi police. And we know what these spontaneous moments of violence do to the public, right? It usually always sets fire to another wave of social protests and action. And so then millions start marching to Sheikh Hasina's home. And really, her brutal and arrogant response sealed her fate. And the protesters, and at this point, this is a populist movement, millions of people that are rickshawalas, working class people, students, teachers are taking the streets, marching towards her house. And they demand her resignation. And on August 5th, within 36 days of the movement, she resigns and flees to India, our neighboring country. And since then, the numbers are over 1,400 people have been killed under her brutal repression. And so that's some of the background of the student movement. And we can talk more about some of the dynamics of it.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I think that reflecting on the ways in which also the sort of like escalation on the part of the government is, I think, a really important story here for sure. Samir, I'll also now turn it to you. What should our listeners know about last fall's uprisings in Nepal, which also ousted the sitting government of KP Oli and his party, and how they led to elections earlier this month in March of this year?
Thanks, Kaden, and happy Independence Day to you, Sharmin. I also just want to start this with, I want to name that I am somebody who was born and raised in Nepal and am spending most of my life in the diaspora now, and I want to name the limitations of my understanding of what's going on in Nepal because of me not being on the ground organizing with the masses. So I just want to name that reality too, and I want to honor what's happening in Nepal and the work that's been happening in Nepal on the ground, right? As somebody who is in the diaspora, and what is my role in the diaspora to support our movement work and our comrades back in Nepal. To set context, so one of the big things that has been happening in Nepal around is like, one of the big things that's really is important to name is like, it's only been 20 years since we abolished monarchy, 2006, right? That is a big thing for us to understand. And the party that was in power and has been in power since was the party that has been organizing our movements, and that is the organized left in Nepal, and like really betrayed our people once they got into power, right? And like started kind of veering towards the right once they got in power. So 20 years later, the economic conditions of our people on the ground are really dire. There's no jobs available. People are migrating. A lot of our folks, one of the biggest source of economy and source of money for our people back home is like migrant work in Dubai, and like really traveling to Dubai, Qatar, and working under very bad conditions and really bad working conditions, right? So that's one of the big things that's also been informing a lot of the consciousness of our young people in Nepal, right? And then one of the other things that's named really important is, so since the election since 2006, the Communist Party, the Congress Party, and the Maoist Party they're the only ones who've been in power for the last 20 years. And these are all old upper class men, even though they were the ones who were leading the movement and were organizing at left. But these were the representation and the leaders in these parties were all upper caste Arya people, which is the dominant caste in Nepal, right? And that's a really important layer to name. And that really informed, I mean, a lot of the ways they showed up after we won. And that's one big question that we always have in the left, right? What do we do after we abolish monarchy? What do we do after we win? And we haven't figured that out too, as does any other movements, right? And 20 years later, the frustration is on very high against the status quo. And there was a lot of, obviously there was a lot of inspiration from Bangladesh, like Indonesia, and like the uprisings there. And like this one thing started trending on the young people started organizing around Nepo babies. There's you don't have access. You're going to take our access away from social media, while your kids and people who have connections to you and have access to you are just posting about the lavish life they're living abroad and in my homelands, right? So that's one of the places where it started. And once that started, there was online campaign. And then after that, and there was already conversations around banning social media in Nepal, and they were finding different ways around it. And that really escalated the way people really responded to the situation. Is once they started organizing around Nepo babies and how they were getting momentum around that, that's when exactly the social media ban went in effect, right? And that's really important name, because a lot of one of the biggest pet peeves for me as a diaspora person has been this idea of people only started the uprising and took the streets because of the social media ban. But all of these other things really added up to it. That was just the point of escalation, right? So fast forward, people started organizing on Discord. Also, the irony of it is that was one of the apps that was banned in Nepal, and people started organizing in Discord. And also want to name the reality of the only people who had access to Discord are also privileged folks like us, younger upper middle class people. So we were not really getting folks from outside Kathmandu and from our villages and from rural areas, right? So they didn't really have any say in what the organizing would look like. So it happened very organically, very decentralized. So there was a call for people to show up at Maitigar, which has been a popular protest space in Nepal for a very long time, and which is at the center of Kathmandu. So there was a call out. People started September 8th. A lot of folks came out, and then people from outside Kathmandu that couldn't make it to Kathmandu started coming in big numbers. And the goal of the protest was peaceful protest, right? And one of the things that happened, that we still aren't figuring out what happened, how some of these infiltrations happened. So there were some infiltrations happening through, I think, don't quote me on this, but my understanding of it from talking to people there is a lot of political parties who were the opposition from the Communist Party at that time started infiltrating the protests, and the protests started becoming quote unquote violent, which was not what the young people wanted. So fast forward, that led to 19 deaths on the first day of the protest, which led to the home minister resigning at the end of the day. But Oli, the prime minister, is so arrogant and really didn't figure out the power of the power of young people and how they could keep mobilizing and organizing. He decided to just downplay them and say, "I'm not resigning," which led to more heightened, escalated protests the second day, where people started marching to the parliament buildings and started burning down buildings. And people got to a lot of the political parties' homes, political party leaders' home, and started burning them, and really started holding them accountable. And also, there was pictures, there was videos of clips of people torching into people's homes, and Sharmin Hossain, who has been in power for the last 20 years in different ways, who is considered one of the most corrupt leader in Nepal from the Nepali Congress Party. got attacked by the protesters. So fast forward, more escalation led to like 52 more deaths, and the Olive party finally decided to resign at the end of that night, and that's when curfew was imposed by the army. So that led to like a total of 72 deaths. I want to name like in just 2 days of mobilization and 2 days of organizing, because sometimes in the left we don't understand. We talk about the similarities of our struggles, but we don't really talk about the conditions that led to it, and like the risk that our folks leverage to be able to topple the government, right? So I just want to name that out loud and honor that part of like how people like really leverage risk to be. And then fast forward, people started organizing. The conversation kept going on Discord, and then there was like a town hall style meetings happening on Discord where like I think 70 to 8,000 people were on it. And also I still want to name again like the people who didn't have access to the internet and phones were not able to participate in that. And decided Susila Karki, who was a chief justice 10 years ago, a woman who also joined protesters during the first day of them mobilizing in the streets. They voted to hold her as the interim prime minister for now. And there was also one other layer is like a lot of people wanted Balansa, who is our prime minister now, but he decided not to be, because constitutionally, if he was part of the interim government, he wouldn't be able to run for prime minister now. So that was like a decision. That was like a strategic decision that like he made and the movement made around not electing him as part of the interim government. So one of the big responsibilities of the interim government was to hold elections in 6 months, which honestly, I was not very.
That's hugely ambitious.
It's hugely ambitious, right? And also the reality is it happened. And also there are questions around, were we able to do hold elections in a way where everybody had access to it, right? And that is a big question that I'm still asking, I'm still sitting with. But there were like record numbers that showed up to the polls, but we haven't really we still really don't have answers around what accessibility looked like for people to show up to the polls. And fast forward now, the Rashtra Swatantra Party was emerged at a very popular party in 2022, won with majority. And we just sworn in our new prime minister, Balansa, yesterday, that we can talk about more later last night.
Well, thank you for both of you for summing up pretty long, complex histories fairly quickly for us. And I think that a lot of the thing that, like, in prepping for this episode that I've been thinking about is the way that, like, Western media largely reports on these kinds of uprisings as if they come out of nowhere. And, like, we know as movement people that rarely, if ever, like, do they truly come out of nowhere. And also, like, Western media, then just the way that our mainstream media here doesn't often follow up on protest movements to be like, what happened? Like, what were the outcomes of people in the streets? That, like, this especially doesn't happen when we're talking about protest movements in the global South. So, like, yeah, I want to dig into, like, a little bit kind of like what the longer arc of these stories really is. And I think when we're putting together this episode, we were thinking about this larger trend that the media identified as, like, quote unquote Gen Z protests, right, around the world. There's like, oh, the young people are rising up, and have largely been described, I feel like, in mainstream media as just like generally anti-authoritarian and generally anti-corruption. And I really want to talk about, I guess, like the specific texture in both Bangladesh and Nepal about how these protest movements position themselves against the government, against like other social forces, and like how kind of like other social phenomena acted on and shaped these movements as well.
I love that question because it allows us to see like also the rich history of our like respective areas and how much like young people have always been at the forefront of so many revolutionary struggles. And we often, post social media era, like to make generalizations that this never existed before. But actually, in Bangladesh, students are actually the most incredibly organized force that has shaped much of our history since 1947. The language movement, which we call the Bhasha Andolan of 1952, was actually led by students across universities that were fighting to speak for our right to speak our language under Pakistani domination. And then the 1969 uprisings against Ayub Khan, the 1971 Liberation War, and then the 1987 protests against the military dictator Ershad. And then later, our return to democratic governance in 1990 and the road safety protests of 2018, which actually laid the groundwork for so much of the student frustration with the government not being able to keep students safe because of road safety issues and just like the general mismanagement of transportation and public resources to make sure students can safely go to and from school. And so the campus has always been a key space for the pulse of the nation, but it's also a key space for goons and vigilante groups to organize their forces. So the Bangladesh Awami League has their faction, the Chhatro League, and then there's, the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the right-wing Islamist group of Bangladesh that has been growing, has their faction, the Chhatro Shibir, and then the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which, has been in opposition to the Awami League, also has their goons on campuses. And so one of the major trends you'll see during these moments is how these factions are actually weaponized to make sure that the violent state apparatus is deployed within public spaces. And, you asked about like missteps and some of the things that political formations might forget to plan for or think about. And, one of the things that I'm sure Samir can relate a bit is like a lot of these student organizations, Students Against Discrimination, there was a group of men who claimed leadership of the student movement and formed a party, the National Citizens Party. And you notice quickly the contradictions of their formation. All the women leaders were either asked to leave or they left because of what an undemocratic, unfeminist space it was. And then you noticed quickly that the National Citizen Party started allying itself with the right-wing forces to gain a populist base. And that to me is one of the biggest contradictions of what do leftists do when we gain power. And also like the sober conversation is, are these leaders leftists? Or
were they ever?
Or did we project our leftist dreams onto them? And I think one of the things that we've been doing for many generations, and I think Vincent Bevan's work really synopsizes this well in looking at the last decade of popular uprisings, is that we've been doing politics without ideology, right? That these political formations actually don't have a coherent theory of change when they're contesting for power. And so you notice quickly the National Citizens Party was very reactionary and it was very anti-fascist by their vernacular. But what anti-fascism meant was that we hate the Awami League. We're going to ban the Awami League and the Awami League is no longer going to exist. And then we're going to fight for Sheikh Hasina to be hanged. Right. And so that became their populist slogan. And so, there is no left force in Bangladesh. And that's something that we have to name. That for sure, there are garment workers that are organizing a party. There's a communist league that does not actually grow in their base. And that is why coming out of the July uprisings, you notice this leadership actually turned center right really fast because they didn't have a vision that was rooted in economic and political struggles of the working class students who made up majority of the base of people that were on the streets. And, it was surprising, Kaden, I'll just say like after the NCP was, getting ready for elections that just happened this past February, they joined a coalition with the largest Islamist force of Bangladesh. And this is such a misstep. Right? To join forces, your enemy of your enemy is not your friend, right? Like where, when has that gotten us anywhere?
Yeah.
It falls into the traps of organizing without a clear, coherent ideology. And then the post-uprising impact is weakened. And so a lot of that groundwork of like theoretical work, like we actually have to do that to be able to be ready for fights that take power in the way that feel restorative and generative instead of what we're seeing now, which is a populist right-wing growth in Bangladesh.
Yeah, that feels like such an important lesson that we need to learn, unfortunately, over and over again. And I feel like this theme of like the enemy of my enemy is sometimes still my enemy has been coming up on this show a lot lately. That like we see it happening in our movement politics here too, especially in this sort of moment of authoritarian retrenchment in our own government. That like there are challenges around that, and there's like ways that I think, yeah, it makes sense that it feels good in the moment to be like, yeah, there's more of us than there are of them, but it's like, well, who are us? Like, what is the us that we're talking about? So I hear and feel that for sure. Samir, I will pass it to you to talk about, I guess, some of the texture that we should know about the protest movement in Nepal, and like what are the ways that other social forces also outside the state have kind of shaped the way that the protests have played out there.
I was listening to Sharmin and I was like, oh, there's so many similarities in like the way, unfortunately, it has turned like, how we haven't really, like the movements turning, a lot of the political forces that led our movements in Bangladesh to like, say casino, right? And also like talking about KPOL, there's so many similarities of like how they were the face of the movement. And I was someone who grew up not worshiping is not a, but somebody who was like grew up somebody who really admired KPOL because he was part of the social movement left. He was part of the first people's movement struggles that happened in the 90s that got rid of absolute monarchy. He was the face of the Communist Party. He did take up arms, right? So he did all of these cool things that, like, our revolutionary histories, like all of the tools that our revolutionary histories have used to find liberation, right? So he used a diversity of tactics. Like he started as somebody who believed in picking up arms, and then he led a people's movement in the 90s of like with other political parties to get rid of the panchayat system, which was a system of absolute monarchy and where all the political parties were dissolved by the king from the 1960 to 1990, right? But one of the big things that I think we didn't think about when our movements were being led, when our movement ancestors were organizing and like really thinking about is like, what does identity mean for our movements, and what does these political forces, the social movement parties that are leading our people and organizing our people, and they did the organizing that happened in Nepal, the door to door, the base building that happened, that was done by political parties, right? That was, which is true, and we need to name that layer too. And I think one of the things that we're missing in this moment right now is we have been so frustrated by the last 20 years of governance by these forces. We want to forget the political history of how we got here. Right. And that has been one of my big critique of the young people in Nepal. Right. And for me, I also think about it as somebody who's getting older and also had access to my dad, who was part of this movement. Right. He was a big force as part of the Communist Party, and now is heavily traumatized because of the way he got betrayed by his comrades. Right. We talk about it every night. And I think one of the forces that I was talking about identity is like all of these political forces were led by men, upper caste Brahmin men, and there was no indigenous representation. So over 20 years after we finally, 1990, we were able to get rid of absolute monarchy. By 96, fast forward, we still don't have full democracy in Nepal. So, the Maoists decided to wage a civil war. That was, and where they really organized the masses and really created conditions for the monarchy to bow down, right? And fast forward in 2006, the Maoist Party came out of the forest and like built a coalition with the Communist Party and the Congress Party to take the streets again. And in 2006, we finally were able to get rid of monarchy, and the monarchy was kicked out of Nepal, right? But 2006 to 2014 was a struggle to like really draft a new constitution for us, where we made some progress and where we also did some things where it took us back around like women's rights, right? And those are some like around some like citizenship issues through women. And so there was a big feminist movement that really created like this organizing conditions of 2020 in so many, like of 2026 in so many ways, right? And one of the things that we were seeing during that the last 20 years is what's happening is all of the communist parties, the people who led our movements and uprisings, were veering towards the right, right? They did not want, because they did not, they consolidated more power, like, exactly what happened with Bangladesh. They consolidated more power where, they could stay in power for long. The indigenous folks were part of the struggles and the uprisings in the 100 years of our movement struggles. But once we won and the Communist Party got into power, they started like really belittling indigenous people. They stopped listening to them, right? And like started like pushing policies that would not benefit indigenous peoples, right? And then one of the big things that Nepal wanted is federalism, in terms of like one of the big critiques of Nepal has been the government is so centralized in Kathmandu. Other people outside of Kathmandu really don't get to take part in politics. And like so one federalism was one of the big things that we pushed for, right? At indigenous struggles, that is the one thing that we pushed for, so that we can govern our homelands. And that was the one thing that Oli was like against too. And that was also one of the reasons why it started became less and less popular, right? But one of the things that's 2026 was, I think it's also really important to understand, is the 2026 uprisings were led by youth who I believe, I dare to say, didn't have like the full understanding, the political understanding of our political histories in that way. And there's this like disconnect in terms of like, and there's this, I think it's hard for me to brace the 100 years of left in Nepal and like, this youth uprising that's happening in Nepal that has no connections because it's not an organized group, right? It's very decentralized.
Right.
It happened on Discord. And that is one of the big questions we have now is like, how do we, as young people, the young people who led these uprisings, how do they stay organized, right? And that is a big question we don't have answers to, right? How do they make connections with the movement histories, and the last 20 years has been very traumatizing, but there's also so many lessons and so many beautiful things that happen during the organizing, right? So how do we make those connections? How do we ask those questions? How do we talk to this feminist group? How do we talk to like workers, right? We really need to figure that out. And I think one of the big things like Sharmin talked about too is like student movements were a big part of how we got liberation in Nepal. And the student movements are like directly connected to political parties because they have the student wing. But that also doesn't mean they are not organized. Yes, they were organized and they really figured it out, but they have gotten corrupt. There's goons there. There's only men there. And like, how do we really ask those questions as a movement now and start building on some of our social movement histories? And that's a big question. And I haven't heard anything, and I'm very curious what's going to happen on that. And I've been sitting with that a lot too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like this question of like, how do we, I don't know, just like thinking about the challenges in remembering and then sometimes like having movement history misremembered to us by people with motivations. Like, I can see how that's like such a, like, this is kind of like a delicate moment in that way for these young people who are getting organized, who are like trying to figure out what they want from the government in the future, that like, I don't know. It seems like there's some real like delicate territory for them to negotiate around, like understanding themselves in a lot of ways as political and historic actors, which is really interesting. One of the other trends that I would love to talk about is this sort of like Western media trend where like an uprising happens somewhere, a protest movement happens somewhere, and they're like, oh, there's an interim government. Great. And then like in the US, we don't hear anymore, right? Like as we've sort of started to drive at a little bit, like the establishment of interim government is, first of all, obviously like deeply informed by the social movements that and social forces that are already moving on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But and also glosses over the like hard work of the way politics is done in a particular place. I'm wondering if there's stuff that you've noticed that has really been lost from the sort of like more international media discourse about the politics of both Bangladesh and Nepal since the sort of student uprising moment. And if there's stuff that you think that you've been seeing in this sort of like interim government moments that you're like, oh, this is something to watch out for. Like, this is something that we can draw some lessons from.
Yeah, well, in Bangladesh, we had, a United States favorite, Nobel laureate, Muhammad Yunus, as our interim government. And I think what's so fascinating is that, he is the world's sweetheart because he created this like, microfinancing program that is, a program that is, they say, empowers the poor people. And we know that in practice, it actually did not reverse poverty, and it actually left millions of people in more debt than, they originally were projected to gain. And so I think what's very fascinating about having such a pro-capitalist figure that is, a sweetheart of empire, it spoke to his legacy in office, during his time, he also also signed one of the most devastating U.S. Bangladesh trade agreements with China, which actually further isolates China from the Bangladeshi trade market and forces Bangladesh to do all of our trade deals with the U.S. And it's a non-binding agreement. And so it is deeply unlawful and also devastating to the economy of this area of Southeast Asia that actually needs China as like an ally, as a country that has really contributed a lot to the development of our transportation systems and trains and local like highways. And so for us, it's also about how much of this interim government was, representing the interests of the global elite and what he was willing to do to be able to squash revolutionary energy within the country. The Women's Commission was one of the most powerful consolidation of feminist leaders under the interim government that were looking to reform land laws for women. And similar to what Samir was saying, right? Women's rights just are the first thing that these governments throw under the bus because it represents so much of the cultural milieu of the tensions between the ruling upper caste and, the South Asian patriarchal DNA of this like ruling body. And that Women's Commission report that was looking to really examine land laws and inheritance laws and the rights of women economically, actually triggered one of the largest anti-feminist rallies in the country's history, where millions of Jamaat-e-Islami men and their supporters took the streets in protest of women having rights. And that was something you did not see the Western media touch. Even though the Western media was like so excited for this revolution, right? On the ground too, you have those people that are like, this is a CIA-backed like uprising, right? And then on the ground, you see like, oh yeah, people actually don't want to touch the complexities of this country because it is layered within like religious nationalisms, ethnic nationalisms, and caste. And so in my experience, I would just say that people know very little of the political forces within this like greater West Asian political landscape and how it connects to US imperialism here and abroad. Pakistan was once the CIA's closest ally in the Cold War, and they continue to be during the war on terror right now. Right? The United States provided Pakistan with military, diplomatic, and economic support because a pro-US military dictatorship in this region that was a staunch anti-communist ally created a buffer between the axis of the USSR, China, and at the time when India was leaning left. We all know that that's not the case now because Hasina's greatest ally is Modi's Hindu nationalist India. And they were actually the largest agents of disinformation that were peddling so much misinformation across every news platform and, X, blaming Islamists with ties to Pakistan as instigating these protests. And then I'll say at the same time, on the ground, there were dozens of reports of mobs that were attacking temples and Hindu leaders. Hindus are a minority in Bangladesh that have been historically marginalized. And these contradictions were getting highlighted, right? Because that violence was eerily similar, right? The partition of South Asia exposed Hindu Muslim communalism. And there were tensions and divides that fell across class lines. And for Western and hegemonic media outlets, this looked like, the Muslims are attacking the Hindus again. And so for me, like the being able to reckon Islamophobia, communal violence, identity and class politics, but also the way nationalism operates in South Asia, it's a tricky dance. And I've been learning how to really convey this complex history because the the country's like beautiful history of like using guerrilla warfare to defeat US backed forces in the region, it also represents something different from its neighbors, India and Pakistan. And within that, you know, we have Bangladesh joining the PLO in Lebanon to fight on behalf of Palestinian liberation. We have the fact that the country's actually inception was based on a socialist vision, right? And it's now one of the fastest growing economies in the world with the fast fashion garment industry that's also ravaged by climate crisis and mass displacement. And so for me, it always just comes back to anti-war and anti-imperialism, like all the nodes of my brain, because I'm like, here's this US global death-making machine and this defense industry that sells tear gas shells to my country and sells Israeli surveillance technology to my country. And then there's this Bangladesh trade agreement that Trump was able to wager during this vulnerable moment for our country. And it's at the core of all the political and economic violence within my country. And so the neoliberalization of our campuses and what these students are facing is because of the war economy. And so I just like zoom out in those moments and I'm like, oh, this feels very much so like Cold War politics and the aftermath.
Yeah, like they had the politics of the Cold War have just simply never left us. Like they're still here, and it's like we've sort of swapped in China as the big bad in a lot of ways.
Right.
Samir, I wonder if there's stuff that you've been seeing about the interim government in Nepal that you think are worth our sort of examination as kind of like lessons that we can draw from what happens after the protest, and yeah, like how that has been part of the electoral moment also that we're in Nepal right now.
Yeah, also the interim government was, what was it, like October, November, December, January, February, 5 months. I think we didn't really see a lot of work that happened from the interim government, but obviously one of the big wins of the interim government was they were successfully able to hold elections. And I think one of the big things is also is like this idea of like, and the Western media has only focused on Balin Saha, this quote unquote rapper, this charismatic guy who's 35 years old and is gonna lead. And then what they're really not talking about the nuances of like what he means for us and like, but to go back to the interim government first, I would also like Susila Karki. I mean, one of the big things that everybody is like, oh, she's the first woman prime minister of Nepal. And what does that mean for us? And, you know, this identity politics of like, oh, we finally got a woman president. And for us, is like when we talk about that's the only thing we see in the discourse. But the reality is she was also a woman prime minister in an interim government that she knew was going to last for 6 months, right? And also one of the things that a lot of people don't think about and realize is like one of the youth really didn't know who she was. And I think that's one of the big things that Sharmin talked about too. It's like, how do our youth have the consciousness, and do we have a social movement left that's actually supporting them to really understand, you know, the conditions of our people and who we're electing and like how we're organizing and what that means for us, right? But she was like, and one of the big popularities about her was like she was not a career jurist, so she was a lawyer that was appointed to the Supreme Court in 2009 by the Judicial Council, and she had this reputation of pushing back against some of the political parties and some of the establishments at that time. So that was like one of the big things that really lured our folks into like, there was this one interview of her that went really viral about how she talks about, you know, establishment parties and how she challenged some of the status quo while she was, because a lot of times what happens with some of these appointments are people who are loyal to the communities, to the parties, right? That was the one big thing that really attracted a lot of her young folks to mobilize around her being the prime minister. I think one of the big hopes for me was being inspired by, and it's just like a lot of unknowns around, like we still don't know, because with the older parties, it was very clear to us that the Communist Party was like more loyal to China, right? And the Congress Party was more loyal to India. And then one of the things a lot that we don't see in the discourse in our even in left spaces, right? Even in media spaces is like we don't see the discourse around like how Nepal is geopolitically for us, like more than US imperialism, India and China is also waging some form of imperialism in our homelands, right? And that we don't want to name that layer, because in the US, as us being in the belly of the beast, our only responsibility is to fight US imperialism. Because for me as somebody from the global South, I understand that how that impacts our movement and how that is dangerous and harmful to our people back in our homeland, because China and India are bullying Nepal in a lot of different ways politically, right? Because nothing happens in Nepal without the consent of India and China, right? And India obviously has more power, and they're like fighting over that power in Nepal right now. And the other thing that I wanted to name is, so one of the hopes for me, being inspired by Bangladesh, was hoping KP Oli during our interim prime ministership, during that interim government, would be held accountable, which didn't happen. And we're not talking about that, right? And also, he had a lot of limitations, and we still are figuring out what kind of powers he held, right? And one of the trends that we're seeing now in Nepal is a lot of people who are even part of the interim government were people who were doctors, people who had this idea of these are the only people who are able to lead our people is like through education and through some of these degrees. And that was one of the things that we were seeing. And we saw the same trend during the elections too, the recent elections. But the hope for me was that you would hold the people who were responsible for our people's debts accountable during the 6 months he was there, which really didn't happen and really moved. And that's one of the things that hasn't been talked about. And I think that was a big political opportunity for her to do some of that work to push KP Oli out of power, because he, after doing all of this, was still able to contest the elections and lost really badly. But one of the things for me, the inspiration was how Sheikh Hasina was pushed out of the country, right? That was one of the hopes and dreams, and that didn't really happen during this interim government.
That's interesting that there's a possibility that he might be back. Well, I want to turn a little bit to thinking about this history that's been unfolding and what it is like to be observing, talking to comrades and loved ones as an organizer who's based here in the US as part of your diasporic community. Because I think that one of the things I think a lot about is when we talk about solidarity with people's movements internationally in the US, sometimes we forget that people from those diasporas are our comrades. They are here. And that we have a lot to learn from them. What has it been like watching the sort of social movements in Bangladesh and Nepal respectively, and what has it been like to sort of have that consciousness as an organizer here in the US dealing with all of the political stuff that we've been dealing with here?
I love that you asked that question, Katie. And also yes, I just want to start with this layer of oh yes, we have comrades here who are from these diasporic communities who actually can inform us in this. And also and to add another layer to that, even with my my history of being born and raised in Nepal and being connected to our movements there and living here for the last 20 years now, right? That also creates another layer where I do have I don't have access to everything, and that also creates a layer of that I don't have to know everything, right? And I wish our Western left understood that layer sometimes, because one of the things that in our movements, I'm gonna talk a little not shit. I don't know how to say it, but I'm a little shit about our movements here, because one of the things that happens is the romanticization of what's going on in our homelands without understanding, and this idea of we have to know the answers to it's okay to not have answers. I think that's a big thing that I reflect on a lot as somebody here, right? And also the reality is I have access to my father, who is, for me, the only revolutionary that I know who picked up, who was part of social movements and who really spent his whole life to the movement and is now still doing things after being betrayed by his party, right? So I think that's one of the big things. I think it's okay to know that. I think the second thing for me as somebody in the diaspora, it's my role in the diaspora. It's also what is my role in the diaspora to inform my comrades, the movement spaces that I hold. I still remember this a long time ago. I think Sharmin, you said that, or I think it was Tenmori who said that at a Dalit women fight. I think somebody said that. It's as somebody who is from South Asia, one of the if you're an upper caste person, it is your responsibility to name that in the movement spaces that you hold and name that layer and inform people about that layer. I think about that a lot, and I sit with that and reflect on that a lot, and that really informs the way I show up as somebody in the diaspora. And my responsibility, one of the things that we saw when all of this was happening was people were really, the social movement left was so fast, got into this train of it's a color revolution, as if our peoples don't have the capacity to organize. Yes, there was infiltrations. Yes, India was involved, but yes, there was also an uprising where 70 people died, right? So just bringing it down to it's not really being complex and being nuanced about that, and that really is harmful to our people back home, right? Because when we're doing that, we're taking away access from our people in terms of how they are doing things, and also really I think invalidating the fact that the governments that was being oppressing against the uprisings are oppressive. So that just like invisibilizes what the state is doing, right? Because it is a color revolution. It is not led by the people. There was even things like they said, like, oh, there were signs in English. Like, can you just think about, the Orientalist,
Yeah.
Orientalist way that you're thinking, even as somebody who considers yourself a social movement left. So that's, I think, that for me, that is a big responsibility. And that is where I can also make an impact as somebody in the diaspora. Because I am not on the ground. That is the reality of it. And knowing where I can make impact and how I can make impact, and knowing very clearly that I don't have all the answers, and I'm an outsider in some way. I go back home every time I go home for a couple of months. The way I show up in these movement spaces is I'm here to listen, and I'm an outsider, and I'm trying to figure out how I can support you. Right. And that is for me a role as a diasporic person. And I'm very clear on that. And I think it's also because I have access to my dad who grounds me in that. And it's like, Samir, you don't live here anymore. He will remind me very clearly. He's like, you don't live here anymore, and you need to understand that, and that's okay. And he will ground me in that. And that really helps me in terms of thinking of how I want to show up as a diasporic person.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And I think that like this thing that you're describing about the sort of like, in some ways like healthy, but in other ways sort of like overblown skepticism that US observers can have about uprisings, revolutions in other countries, just because like the word that came to mind as you were describing it was like infantilizing, right? That it's like as if people can't sort of like independently form their own political opinions without the intervention of the like global superpower is just sort of like baffling to me. You hit on something that like I think about a lot also as somebody who is like a generation removed from the immigrant generation in my family, and like trying to grapple with like I don't have a ton of relationships with my family who are in Hong Kong and China, but like how do I relate to that? It's very challenging. And I think that there's so much in like US like left social movement discourse that I'm just kind of like I actually don't know how to relate to this as a diasporic person sometimes. Sharmin, I'm also interested to hear from you on this.
Yeah. Similarly, I feel like there is this like relationality that it's pushing people that are here to really think about more clearly. I feel like some of the early 70s through the 90s was a very like symbolic type of solidarity that we had where, we would do the cultural attire, the cultural associations, the melas, which are like big fairs that we have in these hubs of like immigrant communities. And now I think the politics are coming back. Like I think after the July uprising, you actually saw solidarity actions popping up across hubs in, New York and California, where people were like, actually, this impacts me. And I want to talk about what this means. I want to talk about the cultural and political organizations that run this local community. And one thing that I really took back from the last 2 visits to Bangladesh is really learning the skills of talking to somebody who disagrees with me, because I think in the United States, the left does not practice being able to engage, talk, even like be in relationship with people that might be politically opposed to you. And so when I go to Bangladesh, I'm actually surrounded by a lot of homophobes. I'm surrounded by a lot of men who like support the Awami League. And I've had to kind of like sit in this in between of being like, oh yeah, like I actually have to learn how to debate better. I have to learn how to like, be that person that's like holding humanity, but also holding the critical left analysis that I believed in to be right, because I know I'm right. Right. And I know that like this is a hill that's worth dying on. And I think with Mamdani's win in New York, like there's so many examples of how that like South Asian left politic that's actually talking about class exists within the DNA of our communities. And, especially for, Samir and I are like the minority South Asians. So we're not the Indian upper caste. And so for us, we're like, this has always been the reality of our people. They are working class organizers. They're people who know how to talk about the intricacies of domestic labor, about the unorganized labor forces, about the people that are left out of the political agenda of our government. And so for me, like I really take some of the lessons that Drum is doing on the ground in New York around like what it means to actually build a member base that's rooted in relationship, but also towards a North Star. And that North Star, it looks a little socialist. It looks a little working class. It looks very deeply rooted in a feminist, like anti-oppressive politic. And I think for someone in diaspora, like that's been the biggest growth area for me, where I'm like, how do I hold this vision and not lose hope that my people are not like all right wing, like people that are out to like, destroy me and my people, but we are in this center right populist moment that will require us to do cultural shift. It will require us to do that like slow work of tilling the land, like Ella Baker's spade work. And, a comrade of mine, Nafiz, who's like a brilliant writer at Jamhur, when I was talking to him about processing the February elections, he was just like, I actually think like I'm seeing a lot of possibility right now because I saw what happened to Egypt after Tahrir Square, and I saw where Egypt went and what a military dictatorship did to that country. And he was like, and Bangladesh, that's not what happened to us. And he was like, and this is important for us to like not compare for the sake of comparison, but like to really reckon with how not to say like, oh, it could be so much more worse, but it could be so much more worse. And we have to work within these like terrains in a way that's like really reckoning with why are people wanting to find comfort in these right-wing religious social groups, because they are the only organized groups of people that are providing shelter, and food. And so unless the left fills that gap, we are going to see right-wing populism. And we've seen it within white supremacy here, but it translates to every global South country, from Brazil to, obviously South Asia. And so, yeah, I'm trying to be more like relative in that way, where I'm like, actually a lot more relative than like we think we are.
Yeah, that is such a good insight about like having to context switch across geography, across political context, like builds a really important muscle for us as organizers. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and I've learned so much from both of you. My one sort of like, well, I have two outgoing questions, and they're sort of related to one another. One is thinking about like, as a monolingual English speaker, and as somebody who's like in the US, I think one of the things that I've often felt a challenge around is like, where do I look to for news, for updates, and for analysis about what's going on in the global South, especially for places where I have no cultural or language connection. And like when you're assessing news and information that's coming out about movement politics, what do you consider? What do you think about? What are the questions you ask yourself when you're like seeing headlines kind of day to day that you think would be useful for other folks to start thinking about?
Yeah. I really think about like multiple nationalisms right now, that there's like these competing forces of like who gets to tell the story. And I always like to think about like how US interests, Chinese interests, or even like Indian interests are determining the news landscape right now. And I don't like to think about it, but I've been looking at so much coverage that feels very much like, yikes, like what is going on with our like news ecosystem? And unfortunately, I think we need to get back on Facebook. Like, I think that the fact that conservatives and the left have left Facebook, like, I get it, fuck Meta. And Facebook is the main place for so much of like organizing. And
contest every space.
get back on Facebook. Who cares if there are right-wing trolls on it? We have to create alternative like information systems that are like really amplifying to these networks and groups of people that are getting inundated with that information. And I think we're really lucky because there's a lot of leftist South Asian publications now, Himal South Asian, Jamhur, like you could become a Patreon supporter and really be a part of these legacy, like of South Asian left thinkers that are actually thinking about like the long-term arc, and they're contending with socialism. They're contending with the anti-communist like legacies of our organizations. And so I just really appreciate that they're doing political analysis with politics and not just focusing on like symbolic forms of like political analysis. So shout out to them and their hard work, because they're English media that is getting translated for this day and age.
Yeah, it was really exciting to me to like do a lot of the sort of like background for this conversation and like find like English language movement media coming out of South Asia. I was like, this is so exciting. Like this is, I feel like in some ways the thing that they're trying to do is like they're kind of our comrades in a sense, right? Like they're trying to do a similar thing to the thing that we're trying to do at Convergence. And I was like, ooh, this is really cool. Like I'm bookmarking this.
Yes.
So I don't know, Samir, do you have other thoughts about like what things US people should be thinking about as they're kind of assessing news and developments?
Yeah, I think, Himal Magazine, big ups to Himal Magazine. I think that is a big source of information for me too. And also as somebody who struggles with reading Nepali now, which I'm very embarrassed of, it's really hard for me to get access to. I have to sit with my dad to like really go through some of the news articles, which, my dad gracefully agrees. I think one of the big things is like, I do benefit a lot from his free labor. I'll just name that on this podcast. But I think one of the things I'll say is like,
Dad.
really like figuring out like I don't know like really pushing through the binary of like what US imperialism means for Nepal and what also there could be other forms of imperialism that I named earlier that Sharmin named too. And also right now I think there's a lot of unknowns for us too, right? We have this party that was not part of the political establishment that came into picture in 2024, so we are still grappling with the idea of like, oh, what does this mean for us? Who are they going to be loyal to? And what does this mean for geopolitics in Nepal, right? So we are still sitting with that question, and there's some clarity around. I think one of the things I would say is like there's a lot of excitement, even in the diaspora community, and my role in the diaspora also has been talking to some of my friends who are stoked about this prime minister right now, because we haven't built a left that is informing them of the nuances and like how we can actually figure out the critique of this person, right? Because for me, I have very clear on what I think it's really important for the social movement left to understand, because even my friends, my comrades are sending me, oh, this rapper is a prime minister now. It's somebody that I trust and love, right? And I have to do the work of like, hey, this person has this history of governing in this way when he became the mayor of Kathmandu, where he was against poor people, right? He did some changes, structural changes that helped like upper middle class people, but then, and that's what we're romanticizing. That's what we are like really like, using that as a way to like really assess what he's going to do for Nepal. And I'm actually skeptical, right? He is somebody from the Madhesi movement, which is an indigenous group that is very marginalized in Nepal, but he also comes from a like very upper class background, right? And that's also real. We have to name that. His party's ideology is to push us away from federalism in some sense, right? So we have to question some of those questions. And also the reality is they had a majority, they won a majority because we didn't have a social movement left outside of political parties that would help us assess him, right? So I think that's the question. Those are some of the questions I would love people to ask, because I am asking those questions as somebody who's from Nepal and from the diaspora, and I check myself every time. And yeah, I will end with like, it's okay to not have all the answers, and just, do some of that work of like reflecting on like asking yourself how you're taking in some of the information that you're seeing. And obviously Himal Magazine is a big source. And I think there's one of the Substacks that I would highly recommend too is, I think we could put it in the links later. It's called Column Weekly, which is on Substack. I have some critiques up there writing too, but that's really been helping me understand what's going on in Nepal right now.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely link to these publications so that people who want to start following this a little more closely can do so. You both have been so incredibly generous with your time, and this has been such a rich conversation. I don't know if there are places also where, if our listeners want to follow your work, if you want to like point people to, I don't know if there's like organizations or places where you are publishing thoughts, either your own or organizationally, that you want to share. Sharmin, is there any place people can find you online?
Yeah, for sure. We're building the Asian American left at 18 Million Rising. So you could follow us there. And I'm at Sharmin Ultra on all social media.
And Samir, is there a place people can find you?
I am a very quiet person, but I think one of the words that I would want to uplift in this moment right now is direct action has been a big part of our struggles in the last few years, and we're really thinking about like how we can escalate strategically. So I am part of a network of direct action trainers called the Ruckus Society. Hit us up. We do trainings. Go to our website, request a training if you need any direct action support, anything about direct action. I think we're doing a training for 80 Million Rising in May, which I'm really excited about. So yeah, hit us up there. We love doing trainings. We love nerding out on action design and thinking about action curriculum and how we train our people to do action safely. And so follow Ruckus Society. And I don't really have a social that's public, so
That's so fair. I respect your choice not to be perceived.
I mean, also, I'm not Sharmin because Sharmin is, I feel I learned from so much from Sharmin, so I just want to name that. And also just from what
we're
people
friends.
said.
Like we've done direct actions together. Like we yell together. Like we've been arrested together. Like
Yeah.
we're comrades. So it's just so fun to be able to talk about. I really,
Yeah.
Thank you for highlighting these like nuances and just convergences. Like been a home for me too to look for organizing analysis. So yeah, it's been really wonderful.
Yeah, thanks again, Sharmin, Samir. Absolutely a pleasure to talk, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Talk soon. Thank you, guys.
Talk soon. Thank you, Kaden. Thanks, Convergence.
My thanks again to Sharmin and Samir for joining me today. We'll provide links to some of the media outlets that they've recommended in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Kaden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Editorial assistance provided this week by Akin Allah, and Kimmy David designed our cover art. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. If you liked what you heard, please let us know. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes, tell a friend, or rate and review the show wherever you listen. This helps us find new audiences and really means a lot to our team. And of course, if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence to bring our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/membership. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.